what's going on? It's new Sony camera day, and after 4 years with the a6600, we now get the a6700. The latest Sony has to offer in the APS-C world. Is it a worthy successor? Well, Sony has done a lot of development in the last 4 years, so you'd hope so. During my short time with the a6700, I found few things that I didn't like about it, and it feels very at home in the Sony Alpha lineup. Changes to the physical design, most notable features like the excellent autofocus, some APS-C sensor history, and a mini review of the new 70 to 200mm f4 macro are the topics that I'm going to be covering in this video. Okay, now, with all that out of the way, let's dive right into it. Starting off with the physical design, it's interesting that Sony decides to differentiate the physical design of their APS-C cameras to their full-frame Alpha cameras. The main difference, other than the size, being the placement of the viewfinder. The A6 series are the only Alpha cameras that offer a rangefinder-style positioning of the viewfinder. The a6700 has the exact same resolution as the a6600's viewfinder, but it's 4 years newer. So, for me, the viewfinder wasn't all that disappointing, but it also wasn't that impressive. If the viewfinder doesn't interest you, you never actually have to use it, as the a6700 now has a fully articulating touchscreen. The touch functions of the ZV line of vlogging cameras are also carried over, giving you direct access to many features without having to dive into menus. If you do have to go into the menus, you always have the two programmable homepage menus to access the most important settings quickly. My only problem with the screen is the brightness in full daylight. It's not super bright and can become hard to see because of reflections. But I guess that's what the viewfinder's for. Moving on to the buttons, I feel like the mode dial and shutter wheel could be reversed. I often found myself switching modes when I wanted to change shutter speeds. But like the viewfinder placement, I feel like this is something you'd get used to really quickly, so this is really just a nitpick. Another button shift that I'm really digging is the record button shift to the top of the camera instead of the side grip. This is such a better place to have your recording button. Another fantastic addition is the photo, movie, and S&Q switch, which separates those options from the mode dial to its own switch. Having these on a separate switch is so much more convenient than having them on the same dial as the program options. The a6700 is actually quite small, which is good for those who don't want to lug around massive camera builds. And with the right lens, you could easily fit this into a small kit bag or even a handbag. Although the smaller size does come at a cost, since we only get a micro HDMI port and only one SD card slot. Maybe Sony will release a side grip accessory in the future to solve both of these problems, and you can have a secondary battery. I think that'd be pretty cool. And speaking of cool, this camera doesn't really stay cool. Granted, most of the times when I was shooting with the camera, I was outside in mostly 30-degree weather. When auto off for overheating is turned off, I never got an overheating warning pop up or a forced shutdown. So I don't really see overheating as a problem unless you just really don't like holding a slightly warm camera. It's compact, easy to hold, and the touchscreen buttons and rearrangement of physical buttons make it much more intuitive to use. The a6700 is packed fuller than a sack of potatoes when it comes to features. Features like focus breathing compensation, subject detection, and active mode for enhanced stabilization not only help you compose a better shot, but also help you keep your focus on point. Sony has stuffed the same dual Bions XR chips and the AI processing unit used in the A7R5 into the a6700. And they've paired them with a 26-megapixel Exmor-R APS-C CMOS sensor, so it's wicked smart. With the addition of all the upgraded brain power in the a6700, it goes as no surprise that the camera employs subject detection. It gets the human, animal, bird, insect, car, train, plane tracking system we've come to love over the last couple years. For human tracking, I must say the performance is really impressive. However, the bird and insect subject detection still needs some work, as the recognition and tracking tends to get a bit more confused the busier the frame becomes or if multiple subjects are present. When using insect autofocus, I think the AI or autofocus algorithm works a bit better in video than it does in photo mode. It was frustrating to see how many times the bee's wings were selected over the heads, although I can see why it'd be harder to program for insect heads, as there are so many varying shapes and sizes of heads for insects, whereas humans for the most part have the same physical features. Fear not though, if the AF misses a shot, the 11 frames per second continuous burst gives you a lot of opportunities to get your subject in focus. In fact, when shooting JPEG standard large in the high plus drive mode, you can shoot up to 1,000 photos in one burst. This is going to be super handy for those shooting sports, wildlife, or in general for those once in a lifetime moments. Though 11 FPS isn't lacking in most situations, The burst rate of the a6700 is by far not the fastest burst rate Sony has offered in a camera by a long way. The ZV-1 Mark II I reviewed a few weeks ago has a much more impressive burst rate of 24 frames per second in the high drive mode. Its max buffer isn't as large, maxing out at 189 shots in JPEG standard large, but to me this is barely a downside. So I'm not really sure why a camera that costs 700 Canadian less has a better burst rate, but there you go. Maybe this is because the ZV-1 Mark II is always in electronic shutter mode? I'm not sure. Something to point out though is that the a6700's burst rate is always the same regardless of whether you're in electronic or mechanical shutter modes. Usually you get a bit of a boost in frame rate when shooting in electronic shutter, but you don't in this case. That's all I've got to say on burst rates. We're moving on to stabilization, and holy cow, can this camera stabilize some footage. The a6700 can stabilize footage really well on its own, and it gets even better when you pair it with the right lenses. This is so handy, particularly for handheld macro shots. It's just so smooth. Two other very important aspects of making great images are the dynamic range and the record settings that you have access to. The a6700 has a 6K sensor that downsamples to allow you to shoot 10-bit 422 4K up to 120 frames per second. There is a 38% crop when shooting at 120 FPS, which is kind of disappointing, but not the end of the world. The reported ISO range is 100 to 32,000, but this camera for sure is not a low-light beast. I'd say anything above 3200 ISO is going to start to look a little splotchy. Of course, using a different lens will give you different results. Using a G Master lens that can go to 1.4 or 1.2 will give you better results in low light. Though lenses typically are the more important investment, choosing a camera body is also a big decision, as the sensor that's in that camera and the size of that sensor will make a big difference to how you shoot. As mentioned previously, the a6700 has an APS-C crop sensor, so here's a bit of history, as I didn't actually know what APS-C meant. The meaning of full frame is pretty clear, as full implies it's the bigger of the two sizes, or the standard, but APS-C doesn't mean full or half, it means a pretty small camera. Well, no, it doesn't. It actually stands for Advanced Photo System Classic, which is a term brought over from the film days. The same way that full frame represents the 35mm film size standard for both stills and motion picture film, APS was a standard of film size for stills photography, which was roughly the same size as Super 35 motion picture film. APS-C is the digital version of that, measuring a frame size of 23.5mm by 15.7mm in most cases. The C comes from the three different flavors of aspect ratios for shooting APS film. C became the most popular for digital cameras. C also happens to be the first letter in chocolate, which is the best flavor of Neapolitan ice cream. Coincidence? I think not. The name of the three aspect ratios are as follows: APS-H for high definition, APS-C for classic, and APS-P for panorama. In the film days, using the HC or P settings would crop in on the full-sized APS film in the same way you can change photo aspect ratio to shoot 16:9 in most digital cameras. Digital camera manufacturers have opted to use the APS-C sizing, as it's the most similar to full frame in that it's a 3:2 aspect ratio. But there was such a thing as digital APS-H. It was a short-lived Canon format during the early days of digital photography, and it was 70% the size of full frame and used in the 1D series of cameras from 2001 to 2009. APS-H digital didn't use a 16:9 aspect ratio, but it was much closer to the size of full frame, and I believe that's the connection and why they chose to use that terminology. Anyways, there you go. That's my little history lesson for this video. I think a big part of why I enjoyed this camera review was due to the incredibly good 70-200mm f4 MACRO G OSS II. Whew, that's one mouthful of a name for a lens, but either way, I'm beyond impressed by it, and I think it's going to change the way that people view f4 lenses. Combined with the extra punch-in of the APS-C sensor, it's like having one of the world's best magnifying glasses in the palm of your hand. I love shooting photos and videos of bees, and this lens made it way easier to get the shot. If you want to see a more in-depth review of the lens, let me know in the comments and maybe I'll be able to get you one. So that's the a6700. I really enjoyed using this camera. It doesn't do anything groundbreaking, but everything that it does very well. That's all I have to say about the a6700 for now. If you'd like to see any of the products mentioned in this video or any other Sony products we offer, head to vistek.ca. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye.